the aim of this session really is to discuss the nature of the division between STS and innovation studies and how that division kind of came about and what we can do to maybe bridge the divide a little bit. So how I hope this is going to work is that I'm going to do a quick, very quick 10-minute presentation, or kind of an introduction really, and then each of my distinguished panel members are going to feed in with their own reflections on the subject, very much from their own perspective. We're going to be quite brief, so that should give us quite a lot of time at the end for more open discussion and hopefully your thoughts and participation on the subject. So we might say some pretty contradictory things, some contentious things, but I hope that will engage you in a bit of debate, we hope, anyway. So, like I said, I'm going to do a brief introduction, which comes in two parts. First, I'm going to kind of present some of the perceptions around innovation studies. Some of these are true, some of these I'm going to argue can be changed. And then I'm going to kind of talk about a possible way forward for innovation studies. So just to let you know where I'm coming from, my own work has used national innovation systems perspectives, but I've also used more recently a more historical approach in my work on drug discovery. So, I'll start with the first common perception, is that innovation studies doesn't examine non-technological innovation. So in other words, it doesn't look at organizational or social innovation or innovation that attempts to improve well-being. It only looks at, people say, innovation that affects productivity and wealth creation. So an exception to this is probably the work in the emerging field of responsible research and innovation. So here a note of explanation, or maybe a note of excuse, because I'm an advocate for innovation studies, is that innovation studies is an evolutionary economic theory. So economic theories have always been influenced by the context in which they were conceived. So for example, Rostow in the 1960s, he wrote a theory about economic development in 5 stages. And in his most famous piece of work, in the book that he wrote, the subtitle was A Non-Communist Manifesto. So very obviously influenced by the politics of the USSR and the US at that time. And so it was with Schumpeter, the grandfather of innovation studies. And he formed his theory of economic development in 1939, when there was very unbalanced, unsteady growth following the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. So Schumpeter was particularly known for his theory on creative destruction, and his analysis covered the period 1875 to 1914. So in that particular time period, heavy industry was very important, manufacturing was very important, and technology in terms of the artifacts, not necessarily non-technological innovation. So what I'm saying is we have to be very reflexive in the way that we think about innovation studies and how methods have been shaped very much by the context in which innovation studies was originally created. So once we understand that innovation studies is not just a static theoretical body, but a theory that can be adapted and changed, there's no reason why we can't progress that theory in a way that would allow it to take account of non-technological innovation. And my colleague Raluca will probably talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So reflexivity, I think, can also help us when we consider a second major critique, which is that innovation studies is too positivistic, overly quantitative, and perhaps a bit prescriptive. So certainly innovation studies, and in particular national innovation systems perspectives, has achieved a very close relationship with policy making. And the NIS concept was introduced and developed by people like Lundvall, by Dossi, by Chris Freeman, by Nelson Winter, Silverberg, and so on. So back in 1982, when Chris Freeman wrote his book on Japan, it was a very history-friendly, qualitative analysis, and he used Listian economics. And it was a case study approach, really, to examine how the political history of Japan resulted in particular capabilities within industries. And his paper wasn't accepted by the OECD because it was too complex. But then a group at the OECD, the Technology Economy Programme, did take up the NIS concept, and they published a report in 1992. And people like Lundvall and Freeman worked with and for the OECD at that time in that particular group. And they promoted the NIS concept. And the reason why they did that is because in the 1980s, there was a push towards globalization, neoliberalism, orthodox trade theory, and neoclassical economics. And that type of economics is all about getting comparative advantage. And the way people thought they could do that was by bringing down wage costs. But this group at the Technology Economy Programme at the OECD, headed up by Lundvall, suggested that competitiveness was a holistic social phenomenon based on a whole set of things. And so the NIS concept was seen as useful, but it had to be adapted in order for it to be useful by the OECD. And it was used as a country strategy for economic recovery, and the first country to do that was Finland in 1992. So the NIS concept was taken up by political bodies like the OECD for several reasons, and those reasons will be talked about by my other colleagues on the panel then in a short while. But generally, more quantitative methods have been incorporated because it's useful to policymakers. So policy itself becomes useful when it can be evaluated, and for something to be evaluated requires something to be measured. So it's true to say that there has been a close relationship between national innovation systems and policy, and that itself has shaped the way that knowledge is produced. The problem is, of course, that not everything can be captured by metrics. So some things are not well understood enough to be captured by metrics, and in the field of innovation studies, for example, the difference between knowledge and information and data, for example, hasn't been thought through well enough by neoclassical economics. But again, if we're reflexive and we understand that the push towards quantitative approaches is not how the theory was originally conceived, nor is it the only way that it can be applied, that perhaps offers us a way forward, or an alternative, which is to go back to innovation systems theory pre-1992 and see if that offers us a path that brings us closer towards science technology studies. So, for example, Schumpeter is an evolutionary theorist, and what we mean by evolutionary theory is that theories that are dynamic, in that the processes they investigate are dynamic. They're able to explain self-transformation, or the capacity of a system to produce novelty. And also they're historical. So a theory that deals with historical processes, processes that are irrevocable and path-dependent. And so, thirdly and finally, innovation studies has a pro-innovation bias. Okay, I'll hold up my hands. This is partially true. And you can certainly find this in many, many studies. There's an implicit assumption that technological progress is a good thing for society. And this comes from the methodologies which are used, which often identify or try to identify the barriers and challenges that prevent successful innovation. But an innovation studies perspective doesn't necessarily have to be like that. And I'm going to talk about that next. So this slide is meant to roughly represent innovation processes within a firm. It's kind of a famous diagram. It's not a great diagram, but just to give you an idea. That firm is situated within a national context, and the national is obviously situated within the global or the international. So currently innovation studies is dominated by questions of how factors in the national context present barriers or challenges to the production of technology or innovation. But innovation studies can be used to look at other questions. So I just want you to notice the direction of the arrows going in. So this slide gives you the same setup, but instead we can ask different questions. And you'll notice this way arrows coming out, not necessarily, this is more conceptual to explain the methodology. So we can instead begin to ask questions about how technological innovation can impact society. So the question, for example, that interests me at the moment is how technological innovation is reordering labour relations in biotechnology. So that's sort of highlighted there, but you can kind of use the same thing to apply other factors. So given that the goal of STS is very similar in understanding the outcome of technological development, the question I suppose is how exactly will innovation studies tackle these questions in a way that keeps its identity, which means it's still innovation studies. So the answer I would propose is to perhaps go back to what Schumpeter instructs us to look at within firms or organisations that produce innovation. And taking these as maybe the units of analysis. So we would examine dynamic processes, we would examine the factors that enable self-transformation and the historical processes that are irrevocable and path-dependent, and see how they have impact beyond the boundary of the firm or the organisation producing innovation. So I guess my questions to you, and at the end we'll have not a question session, because I'm not going to ask you to ask questions. I want you to answer questions and give us your opinions and how you see things. But my questions are, is this feasible? Is it still innovation studies? Does this way of looking at things usefully complement science technology studies approaches? And really, is there any need to bring the disciplines together? Okay, so I'm going to pass you on to Fumi.
Okay, well, thanks very much for Robin, first of all, to set this session, and then thanks very much to Farah for kind of really providing the rich context. And I'm going to sort of build on to what Farah said to us. So this is just kind of some reflective thoughts in response to Farah's questions, and I'm adding sort of some sort of questions myself as well. So my name is Fumi, and I'm based in business school. Along with a couple of sort of colleagues in this room. My background is sort of regional innovation studies. And I look at particularly the role of higher education studies, so I look at like a knowledge exchange policies, knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, and how sort of a university sit in the innovation system context. So that's kind of where I come from originally, and I'm doing sort of slightly different things at the moment. Just sort of, kind of in response to sort of Farah just said about sort of, kind of labour and skill side of thing. I mean, in the kind of context of knowledge exchange, university-industry relationship, I think last sort of, couple of years, kind of skills issue have been rediscovered. So I think sort of overall, sort of innovation studies are sort of changing the direction slightly in kind of recent years. That's a kind of generic observation. But I'm going to sort of start with by coming back to the question which Farah gave to us. So yeah, first one. Okay, so given all this sort of evolutionary economic sort of thinking, is it still innovation studies? And I will say yes, and I think sort of my colleague from business school will sort of give more sort of rich context. But I mean, as we all know, I mean, we have a number of different things here, and we live in a very heterogeneous world, and it's quite confusing as well. We have open innovation, user-driven innovation. It's also innovation, service innovation, mission-driven innovation, or grand challenges that could be related, mission-driven, and social innovation, responsible innovation, which was mentioned early on. And some of the sort of colleagues look at innovation and sustainability transition in a kind of sort of sustainability environmental context, more or less. And then we heard about like a creativity, design and innovation. And also, the concept applies in the public sector or social service, which kind of relates to social innovation as well. So it's all under the roof of innovation, and then the question is there any kind of common framework, or are we just diverging into all sort of different directions? I mean, obvious thing is we are not only talking about science, technology, innovation. It's much, much wider. There are lots of societal, environmental, all sorts of, dimensions kind of coexisting, and that's not really new. We all sort of, work in this kind of complex field, heterogeneous field, but it is quite kind of confusing, I think. And then what we know is it is very multi-level. I think we heard about multi-domain, but it is also multi-level spatially, and it is a complex sort of landscape. And coming from regional studies, kind of economic geography, sort of, background, we talk about different levels, and some colleagues talk about ecosystems, like a biology analysis of sort of, from micro to very sort of macro level, in the sort of from sort of cell to sort of tissue, cell, organ, that kind of analogy. So ecosystem sort of kind of creates all this multi-level sort of, kind of image into our thinking. And then the issue of governance, multi-level governance, and then policy areas covers different sort of areas. So there's sort of colleagues talk about policy mix, and then policy coordination of all these sort of areas. So again, these are kind of areas which policymakers sort of like to sort of refer to. So I'll come to the sort of policy issues in a minute, but then let's just sort of let's paint the broad picture here. And then as sort of Farah said, we've got reflexivity, complexity, experimentation, and issues of governance. It's all in sort of throw into our recent thinking of STI studies. So yes, this is all innovation studies as of now, but it's getting really complex. I think that's kind of how I feel it at the moment. Now, right, I think sort of second question, which sort of Farah mentioned, is something about the complementarity between innovation and STS studies. And I guess it sort of depends on which side we come from. And I kind of, this space is really about the sort of dialogue. So I don't think there is clear-cut innovation studies and STS studies. I mean, from my point of view, to be honest. But I think, personally, I think that the area where the kind of communication dialogue seems to be kind of useful and sort of fruitful is the area where all this sort of kind of engagement dialogue happens. All this, I think in both areas, innovation studies and STS, sort of studies, all actors and policy communities are kind of developing relationship, and then sort of sharing practices and research, kind of practice and policy sort of dialogue, and then the dynamic sort of approach, past dependency, within the context of structural changes, and kind of the kind of interaction between internal, external environment. Kind of this is all what we are looking at, whether we sort of live in innovation studies side or STS side. So, I mean, to me, it just looks like there's not much sort of tension between these two fields. It's kind of feel like these are the sort of converging area from both sides. But as I said, it is a complex area, and this is kind of we all know. And it's not about science and engineering and manufacturing, but it's all about geeks, artists, and entrepreneurs. We heard a number of sort of interesting presentations, including entrepreneurs yesterday, and investors, analysts, and all the other intermediaries in the marketplaces and also social places. So I think sort of interestingly, entrepreneurship studies seems to be, over the last sort of 2 days, feel like coming together in the STS innovation sort of space. So coming from sort of entrepreneurship innovation group in a business, I kind of feel like it's a nice sort of convergence of different areas. But I'm kind of come to a bit of sort of tension between these areas as well. So that's kind of how I feel. There's not much tension in between, but again, how we bring these together and how we sort of place the intermediaries is the challenge. And also, I think what would be useful is kind of look at the role of institutional entrepreneurs and policy entrepreneurs in this sort of field. And when I was listening to sort of Neil's sort of presentation yesterday, I kind of felt like there are kind of intermediary in the marketplace, but there must be some sort of entrepreneurial sort of agent in the wider regulatory kind of institutional setting as well. So that could be sort of somewhere sort of again, entrepreneurship studies or innovation studies could sort of bring some useful perspective or expertise or methodologies into STS studies potentially. And again, sort of skills issues, governance sort of model, that seems to be, again, kind of coming up in a broader context in different sort of areas of study. So that's kind of my response to Farah's second question. And yeah, there's a third question, or one of the questions mentioned by Farah is about the disciplines. And that's something I kind of face a bit of sort of challenge every day working in business school. I'm a bit like a mixed animal. I don't kind of feel like I'm sort of trained as any disciplinary kind of, this sort of disciplinary background. I'm a mixture of innovation studies, economic geography, public policy, and a bit of urban and regional studies. So kind of bringing discipline together is a kind of, I think, sort of practice I do every day, but also at what level, I think that's another question. If you have to write some research grant proposal, that's another thing to think about. So after all, it's like a kind of, yes, bringing disciplines together, but for what? And yeah, I think after all, SDS and STI communities are multidisciplinary anyway. And also, I think we live in a very self-repressive community, so we're always asking, sort of, what kind of disciplinary community are we? I think because we are kind of multidisciplinary as a subject area, we kind of keep asking these questions. I mean, it's a bit like kind of cyclical thing, I guess. But also, I mean, working in a business school is a bit funny because everyone's coming from different areas, but also it's kind of there's a professional sort of, kind of processes of business school and management sort of knowledge happening. That's how I feel personally. So kind of looking beyond the border of SDS or STI, which we are just surrounded by organizational studies, economic geographers working on innovation, entrepreneurship, or people working on public policy agendas, entrepreneurship, sort of studies. It's all around. So it's kind of feel like, how do we really sort of define the boundary? And also what's really kind of makes SDS or STI special, I mean, unique. I think that's sort of one of the sort of challenges as well. And also other things that are happening, I feel, in the business school or more in general in the social sciences or universities kind of creating all these different silos. And then, journals are kind of expanding, lots of sort of professionalization of different areas. For example, I mean, I work on like a regional innovation systems, but then now colleagues are looking at local innovation ecosystems, and other colleagues are talking about entrepreneur ecosystem, which is kind of taken up by OECD and other sort of kind of policy makers as well. It's kind of getting quite popular. But then these literature or these colleagues that are working on these two concepts don't really sort of engage at all. So it's almost like a kind of creating quite close sort of a circle of kind of policy concepts and academic concepts. So kind of feel a bit like, this is a bit like kind of repeating the same thing as National Innovation System. Maybe, maybe not, at the different levels or different sort of policy communities. It could be sort of similar to smart specialization again. I mean, there are lots of engagement dialogue, which is great, but in a way it's kind of reproducing a bit of silos. I think that's another side of the coin. So this is another sort of question I'm just adding to Farah's sort of, introductory contribution. So kind of going back to the question of policy, innovation policy studies. Does it contribute to SDS study, and the SDS study contribute to innovation policy study? I think I'm probably tautological here. Yeah, there are a number of stories, as we all know, conversation and dialogue between the field. And I think one of the sort of recent reflection is the kind of too much systemic and too much sort of rational-driven approach from innovation studies. And my former colleagues at the University of Manchester, Keelan Flanagan and Huzair, did a nice piece recently in Industrial Innovation. They are talking about 4 dangers of innovation policy studies. I think it's just worthwhile sort of, taking a look how they sort of sum up the kind of issues surrounding innovation policy studies. I think sort of, as Farah sort of said, I kind of feel like I'm part of the sort of evolutionary thinking, probably more sort of economic geography side of things. So evolutionary agency perspective is kind of getting a kind of credibility or sort of kind of momentum innovation studies at the moment, sort of focusing on agencies and how that interact with broader policy agenda. So I think sort of we are moving to a sort of interesting sort of, field as we speak now. So yeah, so last week there was a conference in Vienna, sort of all these sort of science and sort of research policy communities are talking about. I wasn't there, but I was just sort of following some sort of social media side of things. And a couple of people, we all know sort of, kind of people like Philip Laledo or Kuhlman was sort of talking about sort of interesting things like it's the gathering of science and technology, innovation policy. Does it really work? Does it sort of make sense? Or like kind of what kind of capable change agent and environments are needed for transformative SDI policies? So I think there are a number of sort of reflective sort of questions coming up, and I think it's kind of interesting time of transformation and change overall. So yeah, this is kind of my final sort of thoughts. Sorry about sort of a bit of a random thinking. So this is kind of in response to yesterday's sort of keynote. I've just sort of thought about some of the expectations we are facing. I mean, expectations or pressure we are under. So one side I kind of thought about academic knowledge market, and the other side is policy market. So in the university, we kind of live under some expectations, like we are trying to target right audience, right journals, right kind of funders. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at the university as a space we live in. And I think sort of, we're sort of having a chat over lunch, just sort of talking about what is it like being a PhD student in business school doing SDX study. I mean, how does sort of, kind of institutional structure kind of influence the way you do research? And I'm sort of, teaching entrepreneurship, for example, in a sort of science PhDs. It's a kind of quite interdisciplinary group. I know some of your colleagues are working on the interdisciplinary research, looking at the PhD program. It's called Optima, chemistry, medical, vet science, and engineering sort of come together, and they run that kind of multidisciplinary PhD program. And I'm teaching sort of entrepreneurship from business school to these sort of students. And I kind of sometimes sort of feel like all these sort of socialization processes, this is where I'm kind of, I'm not really clear what I'm sort of saying here, is probably kind of creating different expectations for the sort of, academic labor market and also the kind of knowledge sort of, the people are creating. So including PhD students, we are kind of sort of molded into certain way of creating knowledge. So, yeah, I'm not really clear on my, what sort of socialization and the expectation we are sort of living towards. I think that's sort of something I just want to sort of throwing as open questions. And kind of feel like I feel like there is a missing middle. I mean, PhD program, all these things are there, but then there are all sort of uncertainties about time, where we come from. So sort of time dimension, kind of temporal dimension, and then how we're going to manage uncertainties under the kind of really sort of, broad range of expectation university system is asking us, or broader policy system is asking us. And then finally, probably another panelist will sort of, give a bit more thought on that policy impact sort of, market, as I call it here. So we are expected to do a number of engagement, impact, or, outreach, whatever we call it. But then what kind of evidence do we have? I mean, we have to do all this case study and impact, etc. But really, in a broader sense, what kind of value are we collecting? Is it individual project, or is it impact from the research paper, or what's the collective value, and how SDI or SDS innovation studies as a collective field, if we like, create that kind of value of impact, and how do we capture it? And that's kind of go back to the issue of measurement and kind of quantifiable, unquantifiable evidence thing. So I think that's kind of another big question. So yeah, again, that's related to the broader governance issue. So I'm just kind of throwing lots of bullet points and questions and no answer really, but that's kind of my quick contribution. Right.
Right, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Raluca Bundichi. I am from the business school. I'm a colleague with Fumi, and I'm very disappointed. I just realized Robin's comment earlier that I was hoping that management and business knowledge is at least at the bottom of the hierarchy of scientific knowledge. And I realized now I was not even at the bottom. I'm outside from this. So that's my very short contribution here. So I'm not sure I'm innovation studies. My I'm sort of, because otherwise I shouldn't be here, but it's the area that I'm interested in is innovation management studies, for what's worse. So what I'm interested in is how organizations manage, structure, organize innovation within organizations, but as well as within their ecosystem. Yeah? So not maybe at national level, but within a particular sector. And picking up on what Farah was saying earlier, one of the challenges in innovation studies is it's very contextual. So it tended traditionally to focus on and assume a world in which innovation relates to research and development, innovation is technology, and is very much focused on manufacturing and generally product-based industries. And one of the challenges of the context in which we live today is that, at least in the Western world, much of the value added arrives from services, not from products. And I was at a conference a couple of days ago with Geoff there, which was an innovation management conference, and the opening keynote, they were saying what are the grand challenges that innovation management studies deal with, and they are very similar. They were talking about the 3S, the fact that innovation studies should look at service, should look at social innovation, should look at sustainability, and also something that you mentioned, we have to look at the dark side of innovation. So not all, if innovation studies have a biased focus on innovation, you can imagine how it is in the management studies, where innovation is about competitive advantage, creating value, and so on. So these kind of issues resonate very much in my area as well. So the question is, if you think about innovation studies, policy level, but also innovation management within an organization, how can we cope? How does the knowledge that we have about innovation apply to in this context, which is increasingly dominated by service? And looking from the innovation management body of knowledge for what's worthwhile, we start to know a little bit more about the service industries, and a lot of the earlier research a few years ago was trying to focus on trying to understand how are the practices, the organizational practices associated with service innovation different from what's going on in product industries and service industries. And we know now that they are very different. So what explains success, or what's worse, in product innovation is very different from what explains success in service innovation. Also how organizations design, develop, implement, and launch into the market services is very different from what's going on with products. So we know differences exist, so they are, we need to take this into account. More recently, researchers have also started to look at variation within services. So one of the problems now is that we assume, okay, we know a lot about products, services are different, and what applies to services. But the problem is that there is as much difference within the service domain as there is between service and product. So a lot of the research now is trying to look at how can we categorize services, how can we order, structure this big sector in a way that makes sense and we can identify patterns. So there is a lot of research, for example, that tries to examine practices in organizing innovation in services by differentiating between types of services depending on the level of knowledge that they assume or embody. So for example, one recent paper is differentiating between services that require tacit knowledge. So these are service industries where the service is much more experiential, such as hospitality and tourism, versus services that require more explicit knowledge, where the knowledge is much more codified. Often in this kind of services, the service is based around the technology, so it can be thought as a technological product, such as the financial industry. And these kind of studies highlight the fact that the practices associated with organizing innovation in this kind of sectors and this kind of organizations is very different. And also there are other studies that look, for example, different types of services depending on the degree to which they engage in open innovation. So for example, depending on the propensity to which firms operating in these sectors use external sources of knowledge or rely on externally developed innovations. And again, the way in which they organize innovation, the practices associated with innovation management is very, very different. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's not simply about we're moving towards a service economy and we need to know how policy applies in this context. We need to realize that service is very different and very vast, and we can't simply just bundle all together. We need to be a bit more granular in how we consider the characteristics of these sectors. Very briefly, because I knew we were going to be late, so I just prepared the slide. If you look at this in my area, so in terms of innovation management, because we are familiar with manufacturing industries and how innovation happens in this context, a lot of the research currently is looking at servitization, for example, so how manufacturing industries move towards services. So a key example is Rolls-Royce, for example, which develops engine as a product, but now most of the revenue is coming from services. So what are the challenges that are associated here in this context? How is innovation managed in this context? What are the practices? And this is important, and there are a lot of manufacturing industries that are moving towards services, but the problem here is that we are complacent because we can draw from the knowledge that we have in terms of product management and apply that to services. But there is a completely different kind of question that maybe we need to ask when we look at service-oriented industries, where there never was a product, there never will be a product. Yeah? So there is a big difference here. And the other thing I wanted to say, and I think this in a way relates to something that you mentioned, is in terms of this idea of ecosystem and the fact that we need to look, whether that's a national level, international level, sectorial level, the way in which innovation happens in the ecosystem, in the array configuration of partners involved in developing and implementing and launching that innovation, maintaining that innovation, and the way in which the ecosystem around the product innovation is organized and managed is quite different from the way in which an ecosystem around the service innovation is developed. And one of the maybe the simplest example I can think of is the local versus global debate. If you think about services, they are produced and consumed simultaneously in the same place. So as a multinational company that engages in service innovation, for example, you have to accommodate for that. You have to have local partners. But that might not be as necessarily always for a product. So the question I have, because all of us offer questions but no answers, is, okay, science and technology studies. You have the science, you have the technology, you also have the history and sociology. So how can it contribute to this problem in terms of, when you think about the changes that go on in the context in which innovation happens? How can we learn from you to address these problems? Yeah, and that's me.
So good afternoon, my name is Geoff Gregson, and I was associated with the business school here at Edinburgh for about 18 years, and I recently moved back to Canada to take a chair at a polytechnic called the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, and I'm going to qualify my thoughts to you on the fact that I'm, I guess, described as a practitioner now. And an academic, so a pracademic, don't like the term. But I'm involved quite a bit with industry and also with policy. And I'm probably going to, Farah's probably going to be angry with me because I'm not going to go after those questions. I'm going to kind of give you my perspective on my experience with science and technology studies. I don't know how many of you know Alfonso Molina. But I started off my PhD at Edinburgh very much focused on regional studies of innovation from a business management, science commercialization. I looked at the Scotland ecosystem and how things were coming out of the public science space. And I started to meet Alfonso Molina and James Stewart and Jamie Fleck, and I started to feel my brain change a bit in terms of some of the questions that they continually ask. So I want to try and identify where I think science and technology studies can have an impact, my own perspectives from my own research and experience. So my understanding of looking at innovation studies in business schools, not just in Europe, but certainly in North America, where I've had increasing experience over the last couple of years, is it's very market orientated, very orientated towards the context. What's the policy doing? What are practitioners doing? What's the current dominant business models going on in those particular sectors, and how do we increase value in private sector firms? What's the role of public institutions in supporting commercialization, whether it's from the public science base? What's the role of SMEs, large corporations? What are the value chains? So very much orientated towards the enablers and constraints to value enhancement. Whereas in terms of the economic departments, it's still very much focused, still influenced quite a bit by the neoclassical economists, which is all about the productivity function and the residual, and trying to quantify the role of innovation. And so, in a recent presentation at the Regional Studies Association, I was talking about some of the different theories that are kind of integrating in terms of trying to answer some of the key questions around regional development. And so you've got the neoclassical, and I won't go into detail on here, but just to identify that there's a number of theories that you might play on the edges of some of those theories, you might pull some things that are relevant, but it's all in response to what's the research question that you're trying to ask. So certainly when you're taking a look at the resource-based view of the firm, which is firms are bundles of resources, human capital, structural capital, intellectual property rights, then it's increasingly been influenced by a slight adaptation to the resource-based theory, which is the knowledge-based theory, which is knowledge resides in people, the tacit knowledge, I know more than I can tell, and that ability to be able to leverage the collective human capital that's available within an organization, and very importantly, to identify where there's gaps in that particular knowledge, and to be able to bring either into the organization, or in the case of open innovation, to say, we'll have a relationship, we'll have a partnership, where those people they don't have to be owned by us, we don't have to secure them full-time, but we take a look at collaborations and partnerships, and there's a whole literature, there's a whole set of studies on the difficulties of running those types of collaborations and partnerships. Mergers and acquisitions, we know the challenges of different cultures trying to come together as well. And then the social systems perspective, which you're all familiar with, and then the different systems of innovation, regional, national, and sectoral. And so the reason I mention those is because I draw upon those types of things with my research. And I suppose a few of us have acknowledged that we're kind of jack of all trades, maybe not masters of any one particular one. But the idea is that we're kind of discriminating consumers with regards to the theories that we need to draw upon. So to me, I'm going to kind of change my perspective now to take a look at the things that I see when I'm working with industrial partners and policymakers back in Canada now, which is their view of innovation. Innovation for competitive advantage, as was identified earlier. And again, coming back to Schumpeter, okay, what's innovation? It's about newness, it's about novelty, it's new markets, new products, new services, business model adaptation. So that notion of novelty, and then how novel is it? Well, is it radical? Is it fundamentally, not immediately, but eventually going to change that marketplace? Or is it incremental? And again, we're still really biased to identifying innovation on a spectrum between radical and innovative. But policymakers are really interested, at least the ones that I deal with, on this notion of identifying how much is it going to cost us to develop policy where we're going to be stimulating small and medium-sized enterprises to do more R&D. And whether it's Scotland or Canada, the same thing applies. Very few small and medium-sized enterprises are investing in research and development for a number of different reasons. One is they don't have the time, they don't have the money, they can't spend time to develop a proposal that takes 2 weeks to do. There's all kinds of constraints related to that. And then there's the challenge of the R&D that's going on in the public science space. How do we extract some of the things from the science space that can be absorbed into small, medium enterprises, let alone large corporations, and that whole interface, again, we know the challenges with that. So when we take a look at innovation ecosystems, again, from a policy perspective, we're taking a look at the enablers and constraints within a regional system, a provincial system in the case of Canada, or in the federal system, and who are the institutional actors and policymakers that are going to have an influence there? Where are the knowledge creators? Are they in the public science space? Are they in the SMEs? And of course, one of the challenges that we see, and certainly saw this with research in Scotland, is that you might have great technologies or great science, great technologies in the fact that you've got codified knowledge, you've got a whole bunch of patents, Edinburgh Research and Innovation. I'd like to know how many patents they have in their patent portfolio right now. But the transformation of that codified knowledge, which clearly has a utilitarian function, because that's one of the criteria for getting a patent, who's going to adopt that patent? So the notion of the technology push market pull dilemma. So this notion of trying to coordinate that innovation ecosystem is a huge challenge for policymakers. It's a huge challenge. You've got different levers, so you put more money into R&D in the public science space, but how much of that stuff is actually getting out and being absorbed by private sector partners? So that's a bit of my perspective. I want to talk a little bit now without overstating some of these things, but again, this is just my perspective, particularly while I was here in Edinburgh, in terms of some of the things that I think science and technology studies can really add to the challenges that we have right now with policymakers and practitioners in understanding what science and technology studies do. And I wanted to provocatively talk about some of the challenges we have as academics in this space in terms of where we should publish. If there's a trend in terms of publications, or if you've identified a new area where nobody else has studied, this notion of going forward and chasing some of the opportunities to publish, but not actually dealing with some of the real challenges. In other words, is that skewing some of the things that we really look at? So these are the things that I found when I was doing my PhD, particularly when I was working with Alfonso Molina. Those of you that know him, he's very much focused on socio-technical constituencies. And one of the things that he said to me was, you can't be looking at this kind of linear approach to innovation that the university makes and industry takes without understanding the local context. I mean, it's not rocket science. It was to me at the time. Oh yeah, that's right. You look at all these different things. So the social shaping of technology and these constituencies, and some of them were very local. Some of them were more regional. Some of them were more national. And in the cases of some of the technologies we were looking at, they were very international. The networks were completely outside of Scotland right off the bat. They were born global technologies and opportunities. The thing I noticed about STS is the unwillingness to accept the phenomena as given, so asking deep questions. Unbridled curiosity, again, that is not common when you're taking a look at some other fields of study. Exploring how the science, technology, and innovation are enacted in practice. So kind of suspending in some cases this over-reliance on saying context is really important. Context is really important. No, there's things that actually come up that have nothing to do with context. The object has been created for esoterical reasons or whatever it might be. Entrepreneurs are not that interested. We find this out when investors take a look at something and go, well, has nobody else talked to you about this product? No, it's been within my garage context or whatever it is. So this notion of gaining meaning that can't be referenced to external circumstances. Clearly, this is a major contribution, unpacking the black box of innovation. Okay, the linear model of innovation that is still held by policymakers, but trying to make sense of that black box. And the notion of hidden meanings, being able to tease some of that out with regards to different questions and drawing on different theories, where, you know, some of this stuff is thought of by certain stakeholder communities as given, and being able to question some of those things. So drawing critical attention and being critical about the status quo. arriving at a better formulation of the reality of innovation in theory, practice, and policy. Again, starting to shake some of the assumptions that are there, particularly amongst practitioners and policymakers. Challenging the traditional views of politics. What's the traditional view of politics? That power differentials are there to stay, the relationships are rather stable. The status of the entities, the stakeholders, how they're aligned within politics is relatively stable, and we're starting to see major changes to that with regards to the rise of the citizen. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just a blip. Technologies and objects are being used to pursue the kind of politics with which we are familiar. So going back to Latour's earlier work. And what kinds of political institutions enable which kinds of involvement by whom in the distribution of resources. So what's our role in informing policy? Just quickly allude to a paper that we did that got a bit of press in 2015 where we did a post-mortem evaluation. Post-mortem evaluations are pretty easy. Something fails and you go, well, we know it failed, so why did it fail? And we had to spend a little bit of time to wait for things to settle down because this was one of the biggest policy failures in the UK since probably World War II. It's about £450 million, primarily Scottish money. And the idea was that we're not doing that well with research commercialization, so what we're going to do is we're going to develop another set of entities above the technology transfer offices that are going to foresight what Sony and IBM and all the big corporates want, and then we're going to come back and we're going to work with the Scottish universities to build things that these companies want. Oh, and by the way, we don't have a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises within that value chain. We're going to create some new companies as well. Okay? So at the time, highly ambitious, and we had the opportunity because we had an MBA student at the time that did. He goes, "Oh, geez, he was from South America." I was like, "Boy, this doesn't really make sense. The Edinburgh Research and Innovation is going to be really unhappy with this because it looks like they're kind of duplicating stuff. I wonder what their IP policy is going to be." Well, their IP policy was all the IP stays with the ITIs. So one was tech media that went to Glasgow, the bioscience one went to Dundee, much to the chagrin of Edinburgh that has a relatively big bioscience space, and then the other one went to energy in Aberdeen. And the idea was to take things from, to procure and identify where there was collaboration opportunities, so highly, highly ambitious. Now the reason I mention this is because it was utilized by policymakers to go after the government at the time with this study. But when we followed up, there really wasn't a lot of change to how Scottish enterprise does their policy. So the lesson here was there was a lot of fanfare, but we really couldn't do much because it was already a policy failure. So we needed to do something when the interim report came up, because this was finally closed off in 2010, it started in 2003, it was pulled well before its time. We needed to be in there earlier, to be providing evidence-based assessment of the fact that this thing was going off the rails, and then to be able to save taxpayers a lot of money. And so this is one of the challenges we have. We have the ability to be able to look at some of these things, but we have to develop relationships with policymakers because we don't get at it. We had to throw a Freedom of Information Act to get some of this data, and this was after the fact. So I'll just quickly bypass this. If you want further information or the paper, I'd be more than happy to send it to you. But this was the very ambitious model, and one of the major problems with this policy is they did not get buy-in from the technology transfer offices. They were one of the key stakeholders, and related to that was the challenge of who owned the IP. So research was too far from market, too many restrictions in terms of the uses of IP, and the licensing conditions for the small to medium-sized enterprises were really prohibitively expensive. And so there was not a lot of absorption. And there were some really, really good people that they brought in that had commercial experience. So just in closing, a couple of last things. Need for further inquiry. Again, these are the trends that we're seeing where there's a real demand. Certainly there is in the Canadian context, and I think probably here as well. You probably know this more than me, but citizen policy making. What is happening there? What are the trends there, and what kind of an effect are we seeing? Is there going to be a tipping point at some point with regards to looking at whether it's renewable energy, whatever it might be? How is it affecting policy? The new participants influencing different types of innovation. I mean, I just can't believe what crowdfunding is doing, and the expectation that crowdfunding was going to be, that was going to grow, but it's exploded. And again, you've got people that can come in, and you've got crowdfunding that is being endorsed by governments. You've got projects that are social projects where, in fact, there might not be a policy there, or a policy's been negated on a particular topic area, yet the policymakers, we found this out in Iceland at the conference that Raluca and I were at, where policymakers couldn't make a decision on paying for something, yet there was a crowdfunding campaign and they ended up paying personally to see how this improvement could be made. And then the technology effects on employment. This is huge. Again, bringing you to the Canadian context with the driverless trucks. One of the recent reports that came out is in the United States, 30 of the 50 states, the #1 job is truck driving vehicles for a living, and they expect the driverless trucks come in. How this is going to play out, one of the forecasts is there's going to be about 3.7 million people that are going to lose their jobs with the driverless trucks. That's huge. And so if we know, even if the forecast is crazy, if we know that's coming down the pipes, what do we do about it? So finally, you've probably seen this is quite controversial. Okay, this is the Fearless Girl, right? And so the Fearless Girl was put on Wall Street this year, and by State Street, which are global advisors, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to highlight the fact that there was very few women on Wall Street in the financial services, which is a bit ironic because they don't have a lot of women in their company either. But they wanted to call attention to the lack of women leaders on Wall Street. And the sculpture for the bull is taking the sculpture of the little girl to court because, as he said, the charging bull, he created that in 1989 after the stock market crash in 1988. And so he wanted to show, the power of the market and coming back and responding. But he says now with this little girl, there's all kinds of perceptions about the fact that the power of this particular bull no longer carries that optimistic message that he wanted to display. That it looks like a negative force or a threat. And that, I think it was in the Atlantic, they said, charging bull is mowing down everything in its path. Carbon emission restrictions, EPA restrictions, anything that stands in the way of making a profit. Okay? So you've got all kinds of controversy going on, and the mayor of New York came in and said, no, the little girl's staying. Okay? That little girl is going to stay because it's become a big phenomenon for tourists and everything else. So I leave you with that because a lot of talk about major changes coming with the capitalist system and the economic model as we know it. We thought that would happen after the credit crunch, but too big to fail. We saw governments provide huge sources of funding. The banks still provide relatively big salaries. But if we take a look at all these different types of trends, what's happening there? Is there going to be a tipping point? Is there going to be fundamental changes to economic practices and how innovation is practiced and how policies come forward? Thanks very much.